Welcome back, and thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, it's only 8 days left before the nation goes to the polls on Wednesday next week. And as political parties get close to wrapping up their campaigns, this week we speak to some of the country's largest political parties to hear how the campaigns went. And this, of course, is another opportunity also for viewers to hear what the parties stand for regarding the priorities and policies, as well as those outlined in their manifestos. Now, today we speak to the head of policy for the Democratic Alliance, Matt Cuthbert, and he joins us virtually. Matt, thanks so much for speaking to us here on Morning Live. You're most welcome.
Good morning, Sakina. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you on your show this morning.
So 8 days before the nation descends at the polls en masse, how has the campaign trail been for the DA?
I think that we've had a solid campaign over the past 2 years. We've put a lot of work into making sure we can get our message out and wide as far as possible across all corners of the country. And I think we've put forward a credible election offer to the voters, one which builds on our track record in government around the many municipalities in which we govern, as well as the province of the Western Cape. And I believe that we've hit the right notes with voters moving into the election. And now it's up to voters to come out on the 29th of May and put their support behind a strong DA so that together we are able to rescue South Africa.
So speaking of hitting the right notes, the Rescue South Africa, the criticism against that has been, and I'm sure you've seen this, that this seems to be harping back to a sort of swart gevaar type of scenario. How does the DA reflect on this, given what you've heard on the campaign trail?
Sure. So I think there's been an additional criticism leveled at it to say that we have some sort of savior complex. And I think it's in total contrast to that. We understand that alone we are not able to rescue the country as one individual political party. And this is why we form part of the multi-party charter. We also, in our manifesto, detail how we believe we need to work with civil society, with the public and with business organizations to make sure that we can put our collective effort into making sure we get our country on the right trajectory. And I think it's never been a case of saying, well, you know, the DA are perfect and we are going to come down upon voters and be able to save them. I think we've always understood that this is a very complex task that we have ahead of us if we are to govern this country. And it's important that we get everyone on board so that we are able to enjoy a country that is prosperous, one that is growing, and one that ultimately ends up with a country that is in a better position than it is today as we sit here and discuss this.
So speaking of the multi-party charter, what is the condition of that pact right now?
I think that it's strong. I think that we have a common policy platform which speaks to a number of key issues which we need to focus on: the economy, electricity, load shedding, specifically crime. And I think that we are geared up for this election. We are urging voters that it's the only alternative to what we call a doomsday coalition, which is a coalition between the ANC and the EFF. And ultimately, if we want to get our country back on track, we need to unite behind the opposition and make sure that we vote the ANC out.
So this doomsday coalition that you speak of between the ANC and the EFF, why is it such?
Well, I think if you look at the policies of the ANC and the EFF combined, and you see some of the positions that they've taken at the policy conferences over a number of years, you look at things like expropriation without compensation, you look at the nationalization of key industries, and then you look at international examples such as Venezuela as well as Zimbabwe and what kind of havoc these kinds of policies have wreaked on the country, then you understand that if these two parties go into government together, the consequences are going to be manifold for South Africa. We also look at a number of municipalities where they govern across the country, such as eThekwini, Ekurhuleni, and to an extent in Johannesburg as well. And there are a couple of commonalities that have arisen as a result of them governing together. Number one, those particular municipalities have run out of money, service delivery has ground to a halt, and ultimately the infrastructure has crumbled to such an extent that residents often go without electricity or water for sometimes weeks at a time. And this is what this kind of doomsday coalition spells for our country. And we must understand that the budgets are bigger at a national government level and at a provincial level. There's more power to be exercised. And if voters put their trust in parties such as the ANC and the EFF doomsday coalition, then I think that South Africa is going to be in a far worse off position.
But the DA itself at local government level have at times voted, or should I say the EFF have voted along with the DA. Granted, it wasn't a coalition agreement, but you have worked together in some of these municipalities. So what does it say about that sort of arrangement?
So let's look at the example of Ekurhuleni. We had not solicited the support of the EFF, but by virtue, I think, of their own local hatred towards the ANC at that particular time, they decided to vote for our Mayor, Tanya Campbell. However, that was not within our control, and they did that out of their own prerogative. And as a party who was forced into government, we did our best to try and get that particular city on track and do what it is that we had at our disposal to make sure that we could improve service delivery. I think voters would have been disappointed with us if we were elected into positions of leadership and we merely resigned the next day and said, well, we're not going to take on the task. I think voters are desperate for change, and the DA is ready to step up to the mantle to make sure that we're able to deliver the kind of change that voters are looking for.
What about the cities of Johannesburg and Tshwane?
Well, I think that we've had a couple of hurdles in the city of Tshwane, but I believe that our Mayor, Celia Brink, is starting to turn the tide. I think the period of administration that we had in the city of Tshwane, which took a surplus that the city had and turned it into a deficit by virtue of that administration and the fact that ANC cadres got their hands in the trough, put us in a very difficult position. But I'm confident, while it's not perfect, things are turning around in the city of Tshwane. Service delivery is slowly improving, and ultimately the financial situation of the municipality is improving by virtue of the new controls and the new measures which the mayor as well as his maker have put in place there. So I believe that under the leadership of Celia Brink, the city of Tshwane will most certainly turn around. I think Johannesburg is a different example where you have a very, very complex political situation, which means you need multiple parties in order to govern. Now, granted, we are in the context of coalitions in this country, but I think without a national threshold, it becomes very difficult when you need to govern with 10 different parties. We've seen how the ANC have used a puppet mayor in that particular municipality and how service delivery has ground to a halt. And I think that the ANC, as well as the EFF and their coalition partners in Johannesburg, need to be held accountable by voters and make sure that they are punished at the polls in 2026 when the city goes back to elect leadership. We have continuously called for the dissolution of council and for citywide by-elections to be enforced so that voters are actually able to deal with the service delivery crisis and come out and vote in favour of a new political option. But ultimately, until the council approves that particular motion of dissolution, then we are stuck with the status quo.
So it's interesting how you characterize this, Matt, because does this mean that when it comes to coalitions, it is only the DA that can lead and make meaningful, good change for the electorate? Because you don't seem to be taking any sort of responsibility for the failures in these municipalities, of which, as the DA, you were part of those coalition agreements.
Sure. So I think the DA is very self-reflective and we acknowledge where we've made mistakes. We are by no means perfect and we accept that. But if you look at our track record in government, we are by far the only party that has the kind of credibility in the track record to be able to say that we are able to deliver in government. I think in the context of Joburg, if you are blaming the current situation on us, that is because of an ANC-EFF coalition with an Al-Jamar mayor in place. And I don't believe that we can be held accountable for that.
No,
and ultimately,
Matt, I'm not blaming you. I'm not blaming the DA. What I'm saying is, what are you responsible to take responsibility for? What are you willing to take and accept culpability for as the DA in the failures that occurred in these municipalities, because you were part and parcel of those administrations that failed the citizens?
Sure. So I think you must cite a specific example, but let me cite one for myself. If you look at Johannesburg, for example, where we had a mayor in place from 2016 to 2018, if I'm correct, one Herman Mashaba, he was then summarily removed by opposition parties at the time. We were then in a short period of governance, I think for approximately a year, when Mayor Mpho Phalatse was involved. And I think that there was a lot of headway made in terms of trying to root out corruption. But ultimately, when you have a 10-party coalition in place, it's exceptionally complex, and it's different governing where you have 3 or 4 parties and you're able to actually deliver on your mandate and your promise to voters. And I think that's what made it exceptionally complex. And ultimately, what we've done as the DA, and why we accept the situation is not tenable, is because we've introduced a series of legislation to stabilize coalitions in the National Assembly, make sure that they are properly administered by an independent ombudsman, understanding the reality that we are moving towards in this country, that we will largely have coalition governments at every level of government. And it's important that we put in place these measures, considering that we don't believe our current legislative framework is equipped to be able to deal with the complexity of coalitions. Now, coalitions in some instances are slowed down delivery. However, it shows in the many municipalities that we govern across the country that coalitions are able to work and we are able to deliver for people across the country. And I think that that's a good sign of the kind of work that parties can do to reach across the aisle and make sure that they deliver on their mandate as well as their promise to voters.
And just before I move away from this, is the DA open to a coalition agreement or arrangement with the African National Congress?
I think that our leader's been very clear on this. We are a part of the multi-party charter, and ultimately our objective is to remove the ANC from power. And if that is not the case after the election, then we are going to go back to our multi-party charter colleagues and have a discussion around what it is we need to do in the best interests of our country. We will also engage with our voter base to understand what it is that they are looking at the DA doing. But ultimately, it would be very difficult for us to go into coalition with a party which we have actively challenged over the last 30 years and who has been responsible for the rampant looting that has taken place, for the fact that service delivery has ground to a halt, and the fact that South Africa is in a very, very desperate situation with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, one of the highest inequality rates in the world, and ultimately in a far less prosperous place than we were roughly 10 to 15 years ago in this country.
So, in short, yes, no, possible, not possible?
I would say no.
Okay. All right, and from there, let's move on to the campaign trail and, of course, your election advertisement that depicts the burning of the South African flag. So, with the benefit of hindsight, what does the DA feel? Do you feel that this has been a success, or would you do it differently if you had to do it over again?
Well, I think that the ad was very jarring in its nature. It was something that was meant to shock South Africans and jolt them into action, understanding that we have a clear binary ahead of us. We either have the option of a multi-party charter government, which is able to get the country back on the right track and start moving us towards prosperity, or alternatively, we have a doomsday coalition with the likes of the ANC and the EFF, and I described earlier on in the show exactly what the consequences of those actions are. And there's been a lot of, chatter in the media, particularly amongst the commentariat, about, the DA being unpatriotic and the DA not reading the room. I think that many voters are very pragmatic and they understand the urgency of this particular election and they understand the stakes at play. And therefore, I believe that voters were able to understand why the DA put that particular advertisement out, and also in its full context to understand that this was the one path that could be followed if there was a doomsday coalition. But at the end of the actual advert itself, we restored the flag, showing that behind a multi-party charter government, we will be able to save our country from the ruinous state that it currently is in.
So you wouldn't do it differently if you had the opportunity to do it again?
No.
Then
this
despite
with the utmost humility.
Despite the backlash, despite people speaking about the Constitution and the emphasis on the national symbols, which includes, of course, our flag as symbols that need to be respected, in spite of the Constitution, for example, mandating us, to use these national symbols within the context of national pride and, of course, nation building. Do you believe that that particular advertisement achieved that?
So I think there's been a number of claims that it's unpatriotic, that it is somehow treasonous. I know that this has come from the president himself. I believe that in part the SABC, who have decided not to run our ad, have also adopted a similar view. And whilst I do believe we need to cherish our symbols, The fact is that if we had an ANC-EFF doomsday coalition in place, then our flag would burn. And that is ultimately the reality that we are trying to get across to South Africans. And I think in the context of freedom of expression, and you would see that a number of media rights groups have come out in defense of the ad itself, you would understand that it's important that as South Africans, and considering the history of oppression we have, it's important for us to be able to express the kinds of thoughts and political ideas that we do as a political party, whether we disagree with it or not. Ultimately, that fundamental freedom needs to be protected.
Matt, we're running out of time. I just quickly want to gauge your response as well to the Constitutional Court judgment yesterday regarding Umkhonto weSizwe Party and former President Jacob Zuma, who would now not be eligible for election to the National Assembly. What's the DA's response to that?
My apologies. There seems to have been a slight internet disruption. Could you please repeat the question, if you wouldn't mind?
Well, I was just asking about the DA's reaction to yesterday's Constitutional Court ruling regarding former President Jacob Zuma and the MK Party and his ineligibility to be elected as a Member of Parliament.
Well, ultimately, we are a party of the rule of law, and the Constitutional Court has made a ruling, and that should be abided with. And that is within their mandate to decide. However, that matter, as brought by the IEC to the Constitutional Court, is a matter that needs to be considered by them. And as for the DA, we are going to continue selling our message and our offer to voters over the next 8 days to make sure that we can get as many voters behind the DA as well as the multi-party charter, so that we are collectively with civil society as well as business organizations able to rescue our country and get ourselves back on the right trajectory towards prosperity and growth.
Well, Matt Cuthbert, thanks so much for your time this morning. The DA's head of policy, Matt Cuthbert, talking to us about the party's campaign and how it's gone on the campaign trail as all the parties start to wrap these campaigns. And this, of course, ahead of next week's general election on Wednesday, the 29th.